History does not just repeat itself. It echoes with a terrifying mathematical precision. There is a specific, lethal algorithm to the way great nations die. It is a 6-stage cycle of destruction that has systematically liquidated 3 of the most powerful governments in the last 250 years. And as you watch this video in 2025, you need to understand one thing. The United States is not merely observing this pattern, we are trapped inside it. We are ticking off the stages, grievance by grievance, blinded by the same arrogance that destroyed empires before us. Think about 1789. France was the glittering jewel of Europe, the absolute apex of wealth, philosophy, and military might. Yet, within 5 short years, that civilization was fed into a meat grinder. The king was beheaded, the church was dismantled, and the streets of Paris ran red with the blood of 40,000 people executed in the name of liberty. Think about 1917. The Russian Empire spanned 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, ruled by a Tsar whose power was considered divine. In 8 months, the dynasty vanished. The Tsar was butchered in a basement with his children, and the country fell into a darkness that would consume 20 million lives. Think about 1959. Cuba was the paradise of the Caribbean, flush with American dollars and modernity. In 24 months, it was gone, replaced by a communist iron fist that would strangle the island for 6 decades. 3 different centuries, 3 different cultures. But when you peel back the skin of history, you find the exact same skeleton. The exact same 6-stage sequence occurred in all 3. And here is the reality that should keep you awake at night. The elites in France, Russia, and Cuba never saw it coming. They believed the system was too big to fail. They were wrong. And right now, the data suggests America is making the exact same mistake. If you are someone who values the cold, hard truth over comforting lies, and you want to understand the future before it hits you, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and have that notification bell turned on. You are going to need this briefing. Leave a like if you are ready to face reality. Now, let's deconstruct the machine. First, you must understand what a revolution actually is. It is not a protest. It is not a riot. It is not voting for a different party. A revolution is a total system reset. It is when the existing order is burned to the ground and replaced by something unrecognizable. Revolutions do not happen simply because people are poor. If poverty was the trigger, the world would be in a constant state of war. No, revolutions happen when expectation crashes into reality. They happen when the population realizes the game is rigged, the referees are corrupt, and peaceful reform is a myth. John F. Kennedy warned us with a foresight that chills the bone. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. That isn't just a quote, it is a law of physics. Pressure builds. If you seal the safety valve, the boiler does not cool down, it explodes. Let us analyze the first case study, the blueprint for all modern chaos. France, 1789. To understand America's trajectory, you must look at France. In the late 18th century, Paris was the center of the world. King Louis XVI ruled over a society that had stood for 800 years. It felt eternal, but the foundation was rotten to the core. This brings us to stage 1, the era of grotesque inequality. French society was sliced into 3 distinct classes, or estates. The first estate was the clergy. They owned 10% of the land and paid 0 taxes. The second estate was the nobility, the 400,000 dukes and lords who owned 25% of the land. They, too, paid almost nothing. They lived in a world of gold leaf and velvet, completely insulated from the misery outside their gates. Then there was the third estate, everyone else. 26 million people. Not just peasants, but merchants, lawyers, doctors, and laborers. They owned the rest of the land, but they carried 100% of the tax burden. The poorest 98% were subsidizing the lavish lifestyles of the richest 2%. It wasn't just about money, it was about humiliation. A noble could hunt on a peasant's farm, destroying his crops for sport, and the peasant could do nothing. Then, nature pulled the trigger. In 1788, a catastrophic harvest struck. The price of bread, the fuel of the nation, skyrocketed. For a peasant, bread consumed 88% of their daily income. When the price doubled, they didn't just get hungry, they faced starvation. And what were the elites doing? While mothers in Paris boiled grass to feed their babies, the nobility at Versailles were throwing parties that cost millions. The disconnect wasn't just economic, it was moral. It was a complete detachment from reality. This leads directly to stage 2, the paralysis of corruption and incompetence. A system can survive inequality if the government is efficient. France's was not. King Louis XVI wasn't an evil tyrant. He was worse. He was weak. He was incompetent. France was structurally bankrupt from funding wars, ironically including the American Revolution. The treasury was empty. The logical solution was obvious: tax the rich. Louis tried. He proposed reforms. But the nobility and the clergy used their political power to block him at every turn. They refused to give up a single penny of their privilege to save the nation that fed them. They paralyzed the government, choosing short-term luxury over long-term survival. Does that sound familiar? By 1789, the government had ceased to function. It could not pay its bills. It could not feed its people. Desperate, Louis made a fatal mistake. He called for a meeting of the Estates General, a national assembly that hadn't met for 175 years. He thought he could use it to rubber stamp new taxes. He was wrong. He didn't open a meeting. He opened Pandora's box. This triggers stage 3, the radicalization of the middle class. This is the most critical stage that modern observers miss. Revolutions are not started by the starving homeless. They are started when the educated middle class, the lawyers, the writers, the merchants get angry. The Third Estate arrived at the meeting and realized the game was rigged. The voting rules were set so that the nobility and clergy would always outvote the people 2-1. The lawyers of the Third Estate looked at this sham and said, "No more." On June 17, 1789, they did something unthinkable. They declared themselves the National Assembly. They gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore a sacred oath. They would not disband until they had written a new constitution. They stripped the king of his absolute power with a piece of paper. This was the tipping point. The moment the educated class declares the government illegitimate, the regime is walking dead. The king panicked. He surrounded Paris with troops. The people, starving and now radicalized by the intellectuals, exploded. On July 14th, 1789, a mob marched on the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized the king's power. They stormed the gates. They slaughtered the guards. They cut off the governor's head with a pocket knife and paraded it on a pike through the streets. The revolution had begun, but it wasn't enough. This leads to stage 4, the total collapse of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the church, the courts all lost legitimacy overnight. The National Assembly abolished feudalism. They seized church lands. They declared the rights of man. But the economy was still in ruins. Food was still scarce. The moderates in charge couldn't fix the mess the king had left. And when moderates failed to deliver, the people turned to extremists. Stage 5, the rise of the radicals. Enter the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre. They didn't want reform. They wanted a purge. They argued that the only way to save the revolution was to kill its enemies. They gained mass support because they promised vengeance. They promised to make the rich pay in blood. On January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI was beheaded by guillotine in front of a cheering crowd. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed him months later. But killing the king didn't lower the price of bread, so the killing continued. Stage 6, the descent into chaos and tyranny. This is the final stage, the Reign of Terror. From 1793 to 1794, Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety turned France into a slaughterhouse. 40,000 people were executed. Not just nobles, but priests, political opponents, and even fellow revolutionaries who weren't radical enough. The guillotine ran all day, every day. Neighbors denounced neighbors. It was total societal collapse. In the end, the chaos was so unbearable that the people accepted a dictator just to stop the bleeding. Napoleon Bonaparte seized power, ending the Republic and plunging Europe into 15 years of war. The lesson of France is brutal but clear. Extreme inequality, plus government incompetence, plus a radicalized middle class, leads to a revolution. And that revolution almost always ends in a dictatorship worse than what came before. That was 1789. Now, let's fast forward to the 20th century, to a frozen empire that thought it was invincible. We leave the blood-soaked streets of Paris and fast forward 128 years. We arrive in a frozen empire that believed it was chosen by God to rule forever. Russia, 1917. If France was a warning about arrogance, Russia is a warning about delusion. The Romanov dynasty had held absolute power for 300 years. Tsar Nicholas II ruled over 180 million souls, spanning from the borders of Germany to the Pacific Ocean. To the Tsar, his power wasn't just political, it was divine. He genuinely believed he was answerable only to God. But while he lived in palaces filled with Fabergé, eggs, and gold, his empire was rotting from the inside out. Stage 1. The feudal gap. While the world was industrializing, Russia was stuck in the Dark Ages. The Tsar and the nobility owned everything. The peasants, 80% of the population, owned nothing. They were technically free, But in reality, they were slaves to the land, breaking their backs to pay rent to landlords who viewed them as cattle. In the cities, factory workers slaved away for 14 hours a day in dangerous conditions for starvation wages. There were no safety nets, there was no hope, there was only the crushing weight of survival. Stage 2. The catastrophe of incompetence. Inequality is gasoline, but incompetence is the match. Tsar Nicholas II was a disaster of a leader, weak, indecisive, and surrounded by sycophants. He ignored every warning sign. When starving workers marched peacefully to his winter palace in 1905 to beg for help, his guards opened fire. Hundreds were gunned down in the snow. That was Bloody Sunday. It broke the spiritual bond between the Tsar and his people. They realized their little father didn't care if they lived or died. Then, he made the fatal error. He entered World War I. It was a meat grinder. Russia sent millions of men to the front lines, often without boots, without food, sometimes even without rifles. Officers were incompetent aristocrats who treated soldiers like disposable pawns. By 1917, Russia had suffered over 3 million casualties. The economy collapsed, people were starving in the cities. And where was the Tsar? He was at the front, playing commander, leaving the capital in the hands of his wife and a mad, mystical monk named Rasputin. The government wasn't just corrupt, it was a hallucination. Stage 3. The military breaks. This is the moment the regime actually died. In February 1917, bread riots broke out in St. Petersburg. Women, freezing and starving, started smashing shop windows. Factory workers joined them. The Tsar ordered the military to crush the rebellion, just like they did in 1905. But this time, something different happened. The soldiers looked at the starving crowds and saw their own mothers, their own wives. They lowered their rifles. Then, they turned them on their officers. The mutiny spread like wildfire. When the army refuses to pull the trigger, the dictator is finished. In a matter of days, the 300-year-old dynasty evaporated. Nicholas abdicated. But the story doesn't end there. A provisional government took over. They promised democracy. They promised freedom. But they failed to deliver the one thing the people wanted: an end to the war. Stage 4. The vacuum of legitimacy. The new government was weak. It kept sending soldiers to die. The people lost faith in everything: the old Tsar, the new Democrats, the courts, the generals. The social contract was incinerated, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into that void stepped a man with a plan so ruthless it would change the world: Vladimir Lenin. Stage 5. The weaponization of hope. Lenin and his Bolsheviks didn't offer complex policies. They offered a slogan that cut through the noise like a knife: peace, land, bread, stop the war, give the land to the peasants, feed the cities. It was a masterclass in political messaging. Desperate people don't want debates. They want survival. The Bolsheviks organized. They armed themselves. They prepared. On October 25th, 1917, they struck. It wasn't a mass uprising, it was a surgical coup. They stormed the Winter Palace, arrested the incompetent provisional government, and seized control. It took less than 24 hours, but the price of that victory would be paid in blood for generations. Stage 6. The Red Terror. The collapse of the old order didn't bring peace. It brought the Russian Civil War, a descent into absolute hell. Red versus white, brother against brother. To hold on to power, the Bolsheviks unleashed the Red Terror. The secret police, the Cheka, executed anyone suspected of opposing the revolution. Not just soldiers, but priests, teachers, and farmers. In July 1918, the Tsar and his entire family, his wife, his daughters, his sick young son, were herded into a basement in Yekaterinburg. They were told they were having their picture taken. Instead, a death squad walked in and opened fire. They bayoneted the survivors. It was the brutal, final punctuation mark of the revolution. By the time the dust settled, 10 million people were dead from war and famine. The economy was obliterated. Lenin's promise of peace meant surrender. Land meant the state owned everything. Bread meant starvation rations. The revolution birthed a totalitarian monster that would eventually be led by Stalin, who would kill 20 million more. The lesson of Russia is terrifyingly simple. When a government is incompetent and sends its people to die in endless wars, the system becomes so fragile that a small, organized group of extremists can topple it overnight. And what comes next is always, always worse. Now, let's move closer to home. Let's look at a nation that looked just like America before it fell: Cuba, 1959. Cuba wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean. It was rich, modern, and flush with American cash. Havana was a neon-soaked playground of casinos, Cadillacs, and movie stars. It had a higher standard of living than parts of Europe, but it was a facade. Stage 1. the gilded cage. The wealth in Cuba was concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite connected to the dictator Fulgencio Batista and American corporations. The glittering skyline of Havana hid the rotting reality of the countryside, where peasants lived in dirt floor shacks, illiterate, sick, and starving. The inequality was visceral. You could walk out of a luxury casino and step over a begging child. Stage 2. The gangster state. Batista wasn't a president, he was a mob boss. He seized power in a coup, canceled elections, and turned the island into a piggy bank for the mafia and himself. The police were his enforcers, the courts were his employees. If you opposed him, you didn't get sued, you disappeared in the middle of the night. Their bodies would be found days later, tortured and broken. The government existed solely to loot the country. Stage 3. The betrayal of the middle class. This is the part history books often skip. Fidel Castro wasn't a peasant, he was a lawyer. He was the son of a wealthy landowner. The Cuban Revolution wasn't started by the poor. It was started by the educated middle class who were sick of the corruption. They looked at Batista and saw a thug who was embarrassing their nation. They wanted democracy. They wanted fair elections. They thought Castro was their savior. Castro played the part perfectly. He was charismatic. He spoke of justice. When he was put on trial after a failed attack, he famously declared, "History will absolve me." He wasn't a communist then, or at least he pretended not to be. He was a symbol of hope. Stage 4. The collapse of authority. Castro waged a guerrilla war from the mountains, but his real weapon was psychological. Batista's brutality backfired. Every student tortured by the police created 10 new revolutionaries. The middle class began to secretly fund Castro. The church turned against Batista, and finally, the United States, embarrassed by Batista's savagery, pulled its support. When the police and the army realized the ship was sinking, they stopped fighting. Why die for a dictator who was packing his bags? Stage 5. The false dawn. On New Year's Eve, 1958, Batista fled the country with hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen cash. Castro rolled into Havana on a tank, greeted not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The streets were filled with cheering crowds. Lawyers, doctors, students. They all thought freedom had finally arrived. They thought they had won. Stage 6. The trap snaps shut. They were wrong. Within months, the mask came off. The democratic revolution transformed into a communist nightmare. Castro didn't restore the Constitution, he suspended it. He didn't hold elections, he declared himself leader for life. The firing squads began immediately. Hundreds of Batista's men were executed in sports stadiums while crowds cheered, not realizing they were next. Then, Castro came for the middle class, the very people who had supported him. He seized their businesses, he seized their homes, he seized their bank accounts. The press was silenced. Dissent became a crime punishable by death. The Cuba that was once the envy of Latin America was frozen in time, a crumbling prison island. The revolution that promised liberty delivered 60 years of darkness. The lesson of Cuba is the most dangerous one of all. Revolutions are often sold as liberation by charismatic leaders who are simply tyrants in waiting. And the middle class, thinking they are fighting for reform, often dig their own graves. France, Russia, Cuba. 3 stories. 1 identical, lethal pattern. 1. Extreme inequality. 2. Government incompetence. 3. Radicalized middle class. 4. Loss of faith. 5. Extremist takeover. 6. Totalitarian chaos. Now, I want you to take that pattern and lay it over the United States of America in 2025. Look at the wealth gap. Look at the government dysfunction. Look at the anger in the middle class. Look at the trust in our institutions. We are not becoming like them. We are them. The data is undeniable. The warning signs are flashing red. And if you think it can't happen here, remember, the French nobles thought that. The Russian Tsar thought that. The Cuban elite thought that. History is a graveyard of people who thought they were the exception. Now, I want you to take a deep breath. We are going to leave the history books behind and look directly into the mirror. We are going to overlay this 6-stage death spiral onto the United States of America right now in 2025. And I am not going to give you opinions. I am not going to give you partisan talking points. I am going to give you the raw data, because the numbers do not lie. The pattern does not care about your political party. It does not care about American exceptionalism. It is an algorithm, and it is currently executing the final lines of code. Stage 1. Inequality beyond the breaking point. Remember France? The nobility paid no taxes while the peasants starved. That was the trigger. Now, look at us. In 1980, the top 1% of Americans controlled about 8% of the nation's wealth. It was high, but stable. Today, That number has exploded to over 32%. That is statistically higher than the inequality in France on the eve of the revolution. The gap between the billionaires and the working class is now wider than it was during the Roman Empire before its fall. We have a class of modern technological oligarchs who fly into space on private rockets, while 60% of Americans cannot afford a $1,000 emergency expense. We have hedge funds buying up entire neighborhoods, turning the American dream of homeownership into a rental nightmare for a generation. The middle class isn't just shrinking, it is being liquidated. We are seeing the return of a feudal system disguised as capitalism. You work, they profit. You struggle, they thrive. Check. Stage 2. The institutional rot. In every collapsed society, the government ceases to solve problems and begins to exist solely to feed itself. Look at Washington, D.C. today. Trust in Congress has plummeted to 15%. Trust in the Supreme Court is at historic lows. Why? Because the people aren't stupid. They see the insider trading. They see politicians entering office with modest savings and leaving as multimillionaires. They see bills written by lobbyists, passed by people who haven't even read them. The national debt has breached $36 trillion. The interest payments alone on that debt are now higher than our entire defense budget. This is the mathematical definition of a debt spiral. Just like King Louis XVI borrowing to pay the interest on previous loans, America is printing money to pay bills it can't afford, diluting the value of the dollar in your pocket. It is theft, plain and simple. The government has become a paralyzed giant, incapable of reform, obsessed with political theater while the infrastructure crumbles and the borders dissolve. Check. Stage 3. The betrayal of the meritocracy. This is the most dangerous indicator. Remember, revolutions are led by the frustrated, educated class. Look at the young people in America today. We told them, go to college, get a degree, work hard, and you will succeed. They did, and what did they get? They graduated into a world of stagnating wages and exploding asset prices. They are shackled by $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, a debt that cannot be discharged even in bankruptcy. They are the first generation in American history that will be poorer than their parents. You have lawyers working as baristas. You have teachers driving Ubers to pay rent. You have engineers living with their parents at 30. This isn't just bad luck. It is a systemic betrayal. When the smartest, most capable people in your society realize the social contract is a lie, that hard work does not pay off, they don't just get sad, they get radical. They stop believing in the system, and they start looking for someone to burn it down. They are the fuel waiting for a spark. Check. Stage 4. The death of truth and the fractured reality. We are currently living in stage 4, right now. The single most critical pillar of a stable society is shared reality. We have lost that. Trust in the mainstream media is dead. Trust in our elections is shattered. Half the country believes the 2020 election was stolen. The other half believes the system is under attack from within. Neither side views the other as a political opponent. They view them as an existential enemy. The courts are seen as political weapons. The FBI and the DOJ are viewed by millions not as law enforcement, but as the Praetorian Guard of the ruling regime. When you cannot trust the ballot box, and you cannot trust the jury box, what is left? Only the ammo box. America has split into two hostile nations occupying the same map. We are not united. We are in a cold civil war, waiting for the temperature to drop just a few more degrees before it turns hot. Check. Stage 5. The rise of the extremists. This is the next dominance to fall. We are seeing the precursors. In France, it was the Jacobins. In Russia, the Bolsheviks. In America, the center is collapsing. On the left, you see the rise of ideologies that demand total wealth redistribution, the dismantling of the nuclear family, and the erasure of history. On the right, you see a hardening demand for nationalism, for strongman leadership, for using state power to crush cultural enemies. The moderates, the people who say, let's compromise, are being purged. The loudest voices in the room are the ones calling for destruction. The population is desperate. They don't want policy papers. They want vengeance. They want someone to walk in and flip the table over. And history tells us that when the people demand a strong man to save them from chaos, they always get one, and the price is always their freedom. Stage 6. The unthinkable. American exceptionalism tells us it can't happen here. We are too rich. We are too democratic. We have the Constitution. Do you think the French didn't say that? Do you think the Romans didn't say that? The pattern is a predator, and it does not care about your Constitution if the people no longer believe in it. Stage 6 in America wouldn't look like 1,789 France with guillotines in Times Square. It would be modern, high-tech chaos. It starts with the balkanization of the states, governors refusing to obey federal orders. It moves to the collapse of the supply chain. What happens when the trucks stop moving? What happens when the dollar loses its status as the world reserve currency and hyperinflation hits the grocery aisle? When the EBT cards stop working, the cities will burn in 3 days. We are talking about grid-down scenarios, organized insurgency, political assassinations becoming normalized, and the fracturing of the military. Foreign powers China, Russia, Iran are watching us right now. They are not planning to invade us. They don't have to. They are waiting for us to tear each other apart so they can pick over the carcass. I want you to look at the trajectory. France, 5 years from peak power to the reign of terror. Russia, 8 months from empire to Bolshevik coup. Cuba, 2 years from paradise to prison. The speed of collapse is accelerating. In the digital age, it won't take years. It could happen in weeks. The United States is standing on the precipice of stage 5. The wealth gap is worse than France. The government dysfunction rivals Russia. The loss of faith mirrors Cuba. The ingredients are all in the bowl. The oven is preheated. We are just waiting for someone to slam the door. Maybe we can stop it. Maybe there is still time for a great awakening before the great collapse. Maybe we can reform the institutions, purge the corruption, and restore the middle class. But hope is not a strategy, and the pattern says we are running out of time. History is a graveyard of empires that ignored the writing on the wall. They all thought they were special. They all thought they had more time. They were all wrong. 3 times in history, the exact same warning signs flashed red. 3 times, the world changed overnight. We are looking at the 4th time. If this video chilled you to the bone, if it opened your eyes to the reality of where we actually stand in this cycle, then do not just watch it and forget it. Subscribe to this channel, right now. Because when stage 5 begins, when the illusions shatter and the reality sets in, you are going to need a guide to navigate the chaos. We are going to be tracking this pattern every single week. We are going to show you what the mainstream media refuses to show you. Don't be like the French nobility, feasting while the fire spreads. Be prepared, be informed. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They are written in blood, in the past.